Okay guys, so for today's Friday feature video, I'm going way off script because we haven't even written one. Basically, we're going to be looking at some gear, so it's a lot easier for me just to ad-lib it instead of writing it all down, looking down and losing where I am. So we're looking at scuba diving setups because even though you might have learnt on a certain scuba diving setup, it might not be the best for you. And when you're first getting kitted out, it can be complicated. You can buy like complete regulator sets, but is that suitable for you? They can also specialize in different areas, so it might be worth kind of considering, taking a step back, considering where you're going to go, where you want to go, where you want to specialize in, and then you can sort of build your regulator and your BCD setup and basically go from there. So this video is really going to be looking at predominantly the regulator side of things because that's where it's most customizable. I am going to mention BCDs and computers and whatnot. But really we're going to be looking at regulators because that's what you can build yourself, what you can customize yourself. And if you buy a great set of regulators at the beginning, you can customize it in lots of different directions. I mean, basically I started off with a single cylinder setup and then I just converted it into a twin set, and I'm basically going to be talking about that today, especially in hose length and all that kind of stuff. So in today's Friday feature video, let's look at basic scuba diving setups. Okay, so first up, we're going to be looking at the real bread and butter, the basic setup. This is very much straight out of the box, kind of no frills, very similar to what you probably would have learnt to dive on. BCD wise, it's going to be a jacket style BCD. That's what most people very first learn to dive on, and they do the job fine. They're the good sort of all-rounder. Just make sure it fits, it's nice and comfortable, and it's got everything that you need. As far as kind of accessories, dive computers, I'd be looking at sort of large screen dive computers, just so that you get a bit more sort of screen space so that you can actually read and see what's going on your dive computer. They tend to be a bit more comprehensive, so you can actually see and understand exactly what it's trying to tell you. But if you're a bit more sporty, you're going to be doing it a bit more professionally, then yeah, you can sort of invest in a watch-sized dive computer and sort of hit the ground running. As far as regulators, so your regulator, you're going to be diving on a single cylinder, back-mounted. So you just need a very basic first stage. You're going to be having at least 4 hoses coming out of this. Over your right hand shoulder, you're going to have your regulator, your second stage is the bit that you breathe from. So on your primary, which is always the black one, these traditionally come with something like a 65, maybe a 70 centimeter hose, enough to get it over your shoulder, but you don't want too much slack. And then your Octo, the yellow version, the alternate air source. This again comes over or underneath your right hand shoulder, and this is usually on a slightly longer hose, usually about 90 centimeters. Is usually the bare minimum that I like on an Octo, because if you're going to be donating that, you want kind of enough space to be able to donate it. And you can get very complicated whether you make it sort of left-handed or not. Basically, if you're going to be face-to-face with your diver and you're donating gas, that's going to be upside down when you donate it, so there's going to be an S-bend in it. So it can be worth changing the hose orientation if your regulator allows for it, but of course a technician has to do that for you. So that's a consideration if you're doing this real basic setup. Over your left-hand side, you're going to have your SPG, your submersible pressure gauge. I tend to just dive with single gauges. My dive computer does the rest, but it is worth considering an analog gauge because if your battery runs out on your dive computer, you don't know how deep you are. A compass as well. I usually have an analog compass on my wrist. It's rare that I put it on my gauges just because I find it makes it a little bit clunkier. So I like to wear it on my wrist. And then low pressure inflator hoses, left side again. For your BCD, it's normally around 75 centimeters long, but that depends on the length of the corrugated hose. Most BCDs, they come with a low pressure inflator hose, so you will get the perfect length. But if you're buying one from scratch, or if you're not buying a BCD, you're just renting, 75 should be fine. Any longer and it just tends to bunch up and it gets in the way and it just creates a snag hazard. So that is very much your traditional setup. Sorry, I forgot to mention your SPG, that's usually on like a 80 centimeter hose. It's got a decent amount of length. It just has to kind of reach the hip, but you don't want sort of too much so it gets sort of baggy in the way. So yeah, so that's basically your really standard basic setup. You can sort of increase it with a couple things. The first one is a dry suit hose. I usually recommend a 90 centimeter dry suit hose as minimum, because that basically has to reach sort of underneath your arm and then around you and then get to your chest valve. So I usually like it a little bit longer so it's not sort of digging in or it doesn't have enough slack to physically reach. And then if your dive computer is sort of wireless enabled, you can fit a wireless air transmitter. If your first stage has enough high pressure ports, you fit it onto that first stage. But I'll always recommend a short sort of 6-inch hose, because if that's attached straight onto the first stage, if that gets knocked or bumped, it's going to damage it really easily. Just putting on a short hose just means that it can sort of move around a bit more. It's less rigid, so it's less likely to get damaged. So that's your real sort of basic setup, but let's take a look at what most people are doing nowadays, and that's traveling. So you can get really stripped down, lightweight setups, and yeah, this is basically your lightweight travel setup. Okay, so now we're looking at travel setups. Now, the main difference here is going to be in your BCD. Your buoyancy control device, when you're traveling, it's usually going to be a wing style. So they're a bit more stripped down. But most people, I mean, I definitely prefer them even in sort of normal diving, but when sort of traveling, I have a very lightweight sort of stripped down wing, so it's very easy to travel. My regulators are pretty similar, but you can get lighter versions of sort of regulators. So this one, for example, this is Apex XL4. Lightweight second stage, and the first stage itself is a bit stripped down compared to the colder water ones. But where you can save a lot of weight is in your submersible pressure gauge and also in your octo. So with a lot of BCDs, you can actually fit it's basically an octo into your inflator and combine them. So that way you can get rid of this entire hose in second stage because it's effectively part of your BCD. And that effectively means that on your regulator setup, you're gonna have your primary, you're gonna have one hose for your BCD, and then a wireless air transmitter, and that's it. So that makes your regulators really compact, really lightweight, and if something goes wrong, it means that you can donate your primary to your buddy and then breathe from your inflator on your BCD effectively. And that just saves a lot of weight. There are some considerations. The first one is that you don't have an analog backup to your SPG, so you have to make sure that you have to get your battery changed in your transmitter and your dive computer very often, just to make sure that they never run out, and that you've got a lot of sort of practice in switching from your primary, donating that, and switching to your inflator, your sort of Air 2 system, your sort of auto air. There's a few different systems out there, and they fit onto the corrugated hose on your BCD, and that's all you need. As far as dive computers, yeah, you can go for something watch size, because it's just small and sort of compact. You can wear it all the time, and then you don't have to have a normal wristwatch and then swap that over for a big dive computer. I started off with sort of watch-sized dive computers. They've got a decent amount of sort of screen space, but you can wear them day to day, and it just gets you used to it. You get used to the sort of user interface very quickly, and yeah, become part of you. After that, then you're just looking at wetsuits and whatnot. Depending on the temperature, you can get away with just a rash vest and board shorts, but you can wear something like sort of thermolution, sorry, not thermolution, like a lava core or a shark skin, and they are basically neutrally buoyant neoprene alternatives. So instead of having to wear a wetsuit, you can just wear this shirt and it keeps you as warm as like a 2 or a 3 mil, but you don't have to add any extra weight to your weight belt. So you can really strip down your regulators and your BCD. There are real lightweight options. As soon as you go sort of lightweight, swapping out your hoses for braided hoses, sort of rubber hoses, they can be quite heavy, especially compared to braided hoses. That's another way that you can save weight on your setup. But then you do sacrifice cold water performance and sort of robustness. A lot of the lightweight travel BCDs, they're made out of thinner materials, so they're a bit more fragile. They'll still do the job, but if you're cramming in and out of wrecks, you're increasing your risk of sort of rips and tears. So that's the travel setup. We're gonna keep it with single cylinder setups, except now I'm gonna look at more of a DIR sort of way of diving in a advanced setup. Okay, so now we're looking at an advanced single cylinder setup. So this is heading more into DIR territory. It's gonna be a long hose primary donate setup. And as far as buoyancy control, I'd be leaning more towards backplate and wing setups. I just find they're a bit more customizable. You can make sure that it fits you perfectly. They do look quite complicated and kind of scary when you very first start, but actually once you do sort of get down to it, they're really customizable. You can get the exact BCD and the perfect trim for you, and then you don't have to worry about sort of BCDs and the D-rings up here when you want it a little bit lower down. But you can sort of stick with a traditional sort of wing style BCD, depending on your preference, whether you're sort of traveling or whether you're sort of diving at home and traveling or just diving at home. BCD doesn't matter too much, but I'd lean towards wing style with this, just because that's the direction you're going to be going. With a long hose primary donate, it's usually best to get a first stage with a 5th port that sort of routes out vertically. So that way, this can go straight down. This kind of sits on your cylinder like that, and this hose comes down diagonally underneath your right hand's shoulder, and that's going to loop underneath something on your waist belt. And then you're going to have like a 1.5 meter long hose, or sort of longer, depending on your size and your build, and that then routes up around your neck. And then your primary second stage is going to sit in your mouth. That's what you're going to be breathing from. I tend to fit a 90-degree elbow onto that, just so the hose sort of routes really nicely, and also a little pinch clip, not a pinch clip, a bolt snap onto that. But that's just personal preference. That's not necessary. So if something goes wrong and your buddy needs gas, then what you can do is you can take that straight out. You know that second stage is working. You just give that to them. They've got 1.5 meters to play with, so they can get their air and everything's fine. And then your octo, your alternate, is going to be sat in a necklace, so it just sits underneath your neck. And then this fits on a sort of a 56, maybe a 60 centimeter hose, and that just goes over your right hand shoulder, sits just underneath your neck, and then after you've donated, you can swap to that really quick and easily, and that's just a very quick and safe way of sort of donating gas, and your hose is all sort of organized. You've got plenty of space for your buddy, so they can sort of get plenty of space. It's not going to be pulling their mouthpiece out of their mouth if you turn to look at something. I just prefer sort of long hose primary donate. BCD hose, much the same as before, depending on the length of that corrugated hose, but this is coming over your left-hand shoulder, anywhere around sort of 70 centimeters, 65, anything like that, depending on how long that sort of BCD hose is. And then your SPG, is going to be on something like a 80 centimeter hose. I usually prefer these brass gauges just because they're a bit stronger, they don't rattle, and they're just a bit more reliable. And then fit a bolt snap onto that so you can clip that off easily onto a D-ring on your left-hand side. And that's pretty much it. As far as dive computers, I normally lean towards larger screen at this point. Again, it can display more information for you, all on sort of one thing, and then that just sits with your dive compass. And that's pretty much your advanced single cylinder setup. You can look up sort of long hose primary donate, and people will explain sort of how it works. I just find it safer and easier than donating an octo that's kind of sat on your hip. You don't know what's inside of it. It's rare that you use it. You kind of check it at the beginning of the dive, but you don't know if it's working down at 30 meters. Whereas with this one, you're taking it straight out of your mouth, you know it works, it's got a really long hose, and then you can swap to that. If that doesn't work, you can just take that one back and buddy breathe. So yeah, this is basically an advanced setup on a single cylinder. Now let's take a quick look at a similar setup, but on twin cylinders. Okay, so now we're looking at twin cylinder setups. So if you're diving on twin cylinders, so two twins bolted onto your back, then you're gonna be in backplate and wing territory. Some BCDs, like recreational BCDs out there, they can handle twins. It's not really what they're made for. So as soon as anyone sort of approaches me and sort of starts asking about twins, it's always backplate and harness, because it's what they're built for. They're rigid, you've got plenty of buoyancy, you've got the customizability as well. But as far as dive computers, again, yeah, I'm kind of looking at sort of large screen dive computers. You'll probably be diving on a dry suit as well, because it's got a second sort of buoyancy for you. If something goes wrong with your bladder, then you can still control your buoyancy with your dry suit. If you're not diving a dry suit, it might be worth looking at a double bladder wing, so you've got a bit of redundancy. So I'm going to be talking about two sort of low pressure inflator hose setups on this. So starting off with your left post, so this is the regulator, the first stage that's going to be sat just behind your left hand shoulder. Again, I usually recommend a sort of 5th port setup, so you can have this hose coming straight out of it. And then I'm going to mount that on my sort of left cylinder at an ever so slight angle. So this hose, which leads to my 2.1 meter long hose, this is my primary long hose. So that's going to go sort of behind my right hand shoulder, down my right hand hip, up in front of me, and then around my neck, and then into my mouth. So exactly the same as the single cylinder, except the hose is a bit longer. It's got a little bit further to travel, and because I'm diving in a dry suit, then it gets a little bit longer, or sort of there's more to go around, so I just make the hose a little bit longer. Other than that, very much the same. Hose comes in from the right hand shoulder. I like to fit a little bolt snap, but that's up to you, and a 90-degree elbow. And then routing downwards, so this is on a swivel turret, so this can go over my shoulder. This is my low pressure inflator hose. That can be a little bit shorter than usual, so that can go down to like a 55 centimeters, but again, depending on the length of your BCD inflator hose, just kind of pick and choose a hose that sort of fits properly. Or you can use this as your dry suit hose. So route that straight down underneath your sort of left-hand shoulder, and then up to your inflation valve. Again, it can be a little bit shorter because it doesn't have to travel quite so far. So you can shave about 10 centimeters off that hose for a dry suit. The same sort of SPG, so we've got a brass SPG, again, tougher, more robust, and sort of easy to read, and with a bolt snap with a decent sized eye on that, so you can sort of clip that off onto your left hand D-ring. So that's the left hand side. That way we can, even if something goes wrong with one cylinder and you have to isolate the two, you can still control your buoyancy, you can still breathe, and you can still see exactly how much gas you've got left in your cylinder, all from one. And then we're going to look at the right hand post. So move that to one side, give us some space. So this is going to be a bit of a mirror image. So mounted onto the right-hand cylinder behind your right-hand shoulder, it's going to be angled slightly downwards. So this hose, so this is either going to be, it's going to be a low pressure inflator hose. It's either going to be to your dry suit, sort of behind your left-hand shoulder and then around in front of your chest, or it can go straight over your shoulder down to your inflator. I just find it gets a little bit of a kink, so I tend to put that on my dry suit hose. It's personal preference. At least then you can, if the flip side of it, this cylinder's working but the other sort of tank is isolated, you can still control your buoyancy. And then the only other hose I have coming out of this is a short hose that leads to my alternate, and this just sits over my right hand shoulder. This has got quite a short hose on it. It's about 55, 56 centimeters, because you don't need sort of too much slack. Again, it just sits in a necklace around my neck, so I can donate my really long primary and switch to that really easily. Even if I'm isolated, I can still breathe from a cylinder, and I can still sort of control my buoyancy. Only thing it doesn't have, that does confuse some people, it doesn't have an SPG, but as long as you've been paying attention and you sort of know your sort of gas consumption, basically your dive is over if you need to isolate your twins. You know roughly how much gas you had, so then you're basically just going to be bugging out, getting out of the water, so you don't always need that kind of SPG. So that's for twin cylinder setups. That's kind of a DIR kind of setup, long hose primary donate. So yeah, let's take a look at any other setups that we might have. Okay, so now we're going to look at slightly different setups, or at least things to consider depending on different setups. So I'm going to start off with your first stage. So your first stage, if you're diving in cold waters, you want to make sure that first of all it is cold water rated. It'll have EN250A sort of stamped into it somewhere. If it mentions a minimum temperature, then it means that you can't go to those sort of colder temperatures. If it is cold water rated, then it's perfectly fine in warm waters. Warm water is lovely for regulators. It's when it starts to get cold, you have to worry about them getting cold and them icing up. So you need something with like an environmental seal on it, so that helps prevent water and moisture from getting inside of the working parts of the first stage, and any other sort of additional sort of heat sinks. I'll show you a couple heat sinks on some second stages. You basically want it to be as such a high surface area to volume ratio that you don't have to worry about it getting too cold. I always recommend DIN. DIN is much smaller compared to an A-clamp. It's a lot lighter as well, and it has a much safer connector. I know a lot of people, especially in the States, they tend to use A-clamp, but with the O-ring on a DIN cylinder, it's trapped. So there's no way it can slip, there's no way it can fail. And I've never, touch wood, had an O-ring fail on a DIN cylinder, whereas on A-clamp, I've had a few, or at least I've witnessed a few. So it's always worth sort of going for the safer option. And they can go to much higher pressures. If you want to use sort of high capacity, like 300 bar cylinders, then you can. But I just tend to stick with sort of 232. Then onto your second stages. So these big fins on this sort of air inlet on this second stage, these are the heat sinks that I was talking about earlier. They're just sort of fins of metal that just allow, because basically when the air rushes through the different valves, it makes the metal parts colder, so it needs to actually sort of absorb some heat from the surrounding water, and you need a high surface area to do that. So these just improve the cold water performance. Now, comparing a traditional second stage to a lightweight sort of travel second stage, you can see the size comparison. So they'll both do the same job, it's just one is a lot smaller, so it's a bit more compact, it weighs less, which means that you don't have to sort of hold it quite as much in your jaw. So for traveling divers, this is definitely worth considering. A lot of the smaller ones tend to be not cold water rated, but this one, for example, the XL4 is. So there's less of a definitive line between, well, this is a large second stage, so it's cold water rated. This one's compact, so it's not. that line's getting a bit blurred. So it is worth looking at the more compact versions. Nowadays, they're better for travel and you can use them in colder waters. But other than that, yeah, sort of the design and whatnot, you can get some with adjustable breathing and Venturi. You can get some just with Venturi. I definitely recommend the Venturi because that just interrupts free flows. So you normally get some kind of switch. It's either on the side or kind of on the top. Some of them are automatic, like on the Atomics, and that just interrupts the free flow. So when you first jump in and everything gets a bit lively, it won't because it just interrupts it. And then you can just flick the switch and get on with your dive. The adjustable breathing definitely does sort of make a big difference, especially for storage. You can adjust the amount of pressure that's actually put upon that on that seat. Then we're moving on to hoses. So hoses, the main difference is in the traditional rubber hose, which are a little bit cheaper, they're a bit more basic, they do the job and they are tough as nails. The newer one is the braided hose. A lot of people call them sort of MyFlex hoses, but MyFlex is a brand that makes braided hoses, but not all braided hoses are MyFlex, so that's worth looking into. Braided hoses, they're much more flexible, they're a lot lighter, but they're a lot more buoyant as well. So when you start getting into the longer hoses, like those 1.5 meter long hoses, when they're full of air, if they're not sort of tied down in some way, they can start to float up, which can be annoying. So you do have to sort of consider how much slack you have in your hoses and how they're routed. Whereas a rubber hose will just sit where it's put and it'll sit there. Downside is it's not quite as flexible, and over time, if you don't keep them clean and keep them as straight as possible, especially sort of up to around where the metal part is fixed, if this area is put under too much stress over time, it can start to crack. So it's worth maintaining your hoses and keeping them nice and flat, whereas a braided hose you can be a bit more sort of liberal with. Other than that, if you're cold water diving, I usually recommend one of these. This is basically a very simple piece of silicone. You can find them on our website. It's basically called a lip shield, and that just sits over the mouthpiece of your second stage, and it just covers your lips. So if you're diving in cold waters and you don't want to be wearing like a full face mask, this just covers up your lips, so it protects them from the cold water. It works a little bit like a wetsuit in that it traps a layer of water just over your lips. It stops the cold from getting to them, and they do make a world of difference. I can definitely recommend a lip shield on your second stage. Sometimes they need to be customized because not all sort of mouthpieces are the same size, depending on different regulator brands, so sometimes you do need to customize it just so it fits quite nicely. Other than that, just keep your regulators clean, keep them serviced as much as possible. BCDs, temperature doesn't really affect them. Your inflator is really the only thing that can get affected. Just don't use it too much in colder waters. And then you're considering dry suits, because sort of wetsuits will get you down to a certain temperature, but really air is a much better insulator. So consider looking at a dry suit, because that's going to keep you nice and warm. And hoods and gloves and everything, again, they make a world of difference. As soon as you're wearing a hood, it keeps your head warm, and then you're staying nice and warm. Other than that, looking at dive computers, some dive computers, if they're running slightly low on their battery, as soon as you jump into cold water, batteries don't like cold water, so it might give you a battery low warning. Don't worry too much about that, but obviously if you do have a backup dive computer, you're going to be switching to that. Other than that, that is it as far as basic setups. There are different setups on like stage cylinders or different ways of diving. It's basically you want to make it so that you and your buddy have the most efficient setup for your type of diving, and whilst this might not suit you perfectly, it's definitely basically a stepping stone that you can start there and then customize it depending on sort of what type of diver you are and type of equipment that you're using, and then just try and reduce and make it as efficient as possible. But let us know in the comments below what scuba diving setup you use and why, and what kind of scuba diving you do, because that can help others kind of understand what type of diving and what kind of setup they need to be looking at. Thanks for watching, guys, and safe diving.
Don't forget to hit the bell icon, like, share and subscribe and all that as well.
We don't do that on these videos.
We do now. Bye!
We are an online dive store serving the UK and the world for all your diving equipment needs. So why not visit us at simplyscuba.com or click the box on your screen.